My brother called me waste of oxygen in front of the entire restaurant. What he didn't realize was that I owned a company rejecting all his business proposals. At 32, I discovered that being underestimated isn't a weakness, it's the most powerful weapon you'll ever possess. What happened next changed everything I believed about family, success, and the sweet taste of justice served cold. I've been working at Romano's Bistro for nearly 18 months now. Not because I have to, but because there's something grounding about honest work. The rhythm of service, the genuine conversations with regulars, the way a perfectly timed meal can brighten someone's entire day. It pays decent money for 3 shifts a week, and frankly, it's a welcome break from analyzing market projections and negotiating acquisition deals. Yeah, I said deals, but we'll get to that part of the story when the time is right. My family has always seen me as their greatest disappointment. Ever since sophomore year, when my older brother Christopher landed that prestigious scholarship to Pemberton Academy while I remained at Lincoln Public High, grinding through AP classes without fanfare. I still remember the exact moment everything crystallized. Mom and Dad mortgaged our modest colonial to cover Christopher's remaining tuition, then sat me down at our kitchen table on a rainy Tuesday evening. The words are burned into my memory. Michael, not everyone is destined for greatness, and that's perfectly acceptable. Some people are meant to be the foundation that supports those who soar. I was 17 when she delivered that verdict. 17 years old, sitting there with my report card full of A's and B's, listening to my mother explain why my future had already been decided. Christopher graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern's business program, while I spent those same years working residential roofing jobs, saving every dollar I could scrape together. My parents would beam with pride at family gatherings, regaling relatives with tales of Christopher's internships at Fortune 500 companies, while somehow managing to forget I existed entirely. When I finally saved enough to move into my own apartment at 22, Dad handed me a toilet brush as a housewarming gift. "You'll need this more than champagne," he said with a chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. 3 decades of life experience has taught me that some wounds never heal. They just teach you how to carry the weight differently. Fast forward to last month. I'm working my regular Wednesday dinner shift, wearing my black Romano's polo with a small embroidered logo, when Angela, our hostess, seats a party of 4 at table 12 in my section. I glance up from polishing wine glasses, and my blood turns to ice water. Christopher, both my parents, and an elegant brunette I don't recognize are settling into the burgundy leather booth that overlooks the restaurant's garden patio. Christopher spots me first. His expression transforms from casual contentment to barely contained amusement, like someone who's just discovered the most delicious secret. Then his voice cuts through the ambient dinner conversation, loud enough to turn heads 3 tables away. "Jesus Christ, still playing dress up as a waiter at 32? What an absolute waste of oxygen." The entire dining room seems to pause. Conversations falter mid-sentence. I'm standing there with a water pitcher in each hand, watching my brother point at me like I'm some kind of exhibit while his date, gorgeous, clearly expensive, definitely out of his league, stares at me with a mixture of curiosity and pity. "This is the family black sheep I mentioned," Christopher announces to his companion. "We usually tell people he's doing missionary work overseas because it's less mortifying than the truth." My mother rises from her seat with the practiced grace of someone who's perfected the art of public humiliation. She approaches me with that concerned expression she reserves for wounded animals and disappointing children, placing her manicured hand on my forearm like she's comforting a terminally ill patient. "Sweetheart, this is exactly why we had to take down your graduation photos," she says in a stage whisper that carries to every corner of my section. When the Hendersons visit for dinner parties, we find it easier to explain that we have just one son. It prevents those awkward questions about what went wrong. The casual cruelty of it takes my breath away. 32 years old, and my own mother is explaining to a room full of strangers why I've been erased from the family narrative. Dad joins the performance, pulling out his leather wallet with a kind of theatrical flourish reserved for street corner charity. He counts out several 20s, laying them on my spotless table like he's tipping a panhandler who's provided adequate entertainment. "Here's $85, son. Maybe it's time to finally make something of yourself." He gestures vaguely toward Christopher, who's now leaning back in the booth with a satisfied smirk of someone watching their favorite movie. Your brother just closed on his third investment property. Perhaps he could find you something entry-level at his firm. Christopher's date, Rebecca, I later learned, looks genuinely confused by the family dynamics unfolding before her. Is he? Does he have some kind of learning disability? She asks in the kind of hushed tone people use when discussing terminal diagnoses. Christopher throws back his head and laughs with genuine delight. No, Rebecca. He's just naturally gifted at failure. Some people are born to succeed. Others are born to serve those who do. Natural order of things. I stood there absorbing every word, every sneer, every pitying glance from nearby diners who were pretending not to watch the most uncomfortable family reunion in Romano's recent history. My manager, David, was positioned near the bar, clearly calculating whether he needed to intervene. My colleague Sarah had stopped mid-stride with an expression of pure horror plastered across her face. So I did the only thing that made sense in that moment. I smiled, not the bitter, defeated smile of someone accepting their fate, but the calm, knowing smile of someone holding all the cards. I set down both water pitchers with deliberate precision and said, "Good evening, folks. I'll be taking care of your table tonight. Can I start you off with some appetizers?" Then I took their order like nothing had happened. For the next 90 minutes, I provided flawless service while they continued their performance. Dad offered career advice between bites of his salmon, suggesting I might have more success in manual labor since I'd already proven intellectual pursuits weren't my strong suit. Christopher regaled Rebecca with stories about his corner office and his German luxury sedan, while she kept glancing at me like I might suddenly snap and start throwing silverware. The beautiful irony is that this kind of treatment had become so routine, so predictable, that I developed an immunity to their poison years ago. What they didn't know, what none of them had bothered to discover, was that I'd been living a completely different life for the past 6 years. After I left construction, I spent 8 months studying for my real estate license. Not because anyone encouraged me, but because I'd always been fascinated by the intersection of location, value, and human psychology. I started small, flipping a modest duplex with money I'd saved from roofing jobs. The profit was enough to try again. Then again. By year 3, I'd partnered with Elena Rodriguez, a developer who needed someone with construction experience and an eye for undervalued properties. 7 years later, I own Martinez Development Group, a boutique real estate investment company that specializes in transforming overlooked neighborhoods into thriving communities. I purchased my house in Willowbrook Heights 18 months ago. Cash deal, no mortgage. It's a 3-bedroom craftsman with lake views and a deck where I watch the sunrise while planning my next acquisition. I drive a 4-year-old Toyota Camry because I don't need to prove anything to anyone, and I work at Romano's because I genuinely enjoy the human connection and the reminder of where I came from. After they left, 12% tip. Naturally, David approached with the kind of careful concern you'd show someone who'd just witnessed a car accident. "Michael, are you okay? Do you need to talk to someone?" I assured him I was fine. Sarah offered to key Christopher's BMW, which made me laugh for the first time that evening. But as I drove home through the quiet streets of my neighborhood, something had fundamentally shifted. For years, I'd maintained my silence partly out of genuine humility, but mostly because I didn't want to deal with the inevitable complications. I didn't want Christopher suddenly becoming interested in my business contacts, or my parents were writing history to make themselves the heroes of my success story. But watching my father literally throw money at me like I was begging for change had crossed a line I didn't even know existed. The thing is, Christopher's impressive career trajectory isn't quite as stellar as he makes it sound. He works as a senior associate at Blackstone Commercial Properties, a mid-tier firm that's been desperately trying to break into the high-end development market for years. They've been pursuing a partnership with Rodriguez Development, my company, for 8 months, submitting proposal after proposal that I've personally rejected. Not out of spite, but because their vision doesn't align with our community-focused approach. Christopher's third investment property, the one he was bragging about, sits in the Riverside Commons development that my company has been quietly negotiating to acquire for complete redevelopment. His timing was spectacularly poor. He bought at the peak of an artificially inflated market, financing 92% of the purchase price just 3 months before the original developer began showing signs of financial distress. My parents' retirement nest egg is heavily invested in a commercial real estate portfolio that includes several properties my company is positioning to acquire as part of a major downtown revitalization project. With a few strategic phone calls, I could significantly impact their financial future. I've always taken the high road, always absorbed their criticism with quiet dignity, always changed the subject when relatives asked about my mysterious career. But after watching my mother explain to a roomful of strangers why I'd been edited out of the family story, something fundamental had shifted in my chest. A door that had been locked for years had suddenly swung wide open. So that night, I called Elena. I told her I was ready to accelerate our timeline on the Riverside Commons acquisition. I also mentioned that I'd be attending the Regional Development Summit next month, the industry event where Christopher's boss has been desperately seeking FaceTime with key players in our market. 4 weeks from today, my family is going to discover exactly what their greatest disappointment has been building while they weren't paying attention. And I'm going to savor every moment of their realization. Trust me, you'll want to hear what happens next. 2 weeks after the restaurant incident, my mother texted me as if nothing had occurred. Just a casual thinking of you, sweetheart. How's everything going? Message, as if she hadn't just explained to an entire dining room why I'd been excised from the family portrait gallery. I let her message sit unread for 4 days before responding that I was busy with some work projects. True. And that we'd catch up soon. Decidedly false. What I was actually doing was orchestrating a series of business moves that would redefine my family's understanding of success and failure. Christopher's third investment property wasn't just in a development my company was acquiring, it was the cornerstone property that would determine the entire project's viability. After spending that weekend reviewing architectural plans and financial projections with Elena, we discovered that Christopher had made every possible mistake an amateur investor could make. He'd bought at an artificially inflated price, financed almost the entire purchase, and failed to research the original developer's financial stability. The Riverside Commons project had been hemorrhaging money for 18 months, which was precisely why my company had been positioning to acquire it at a significant discount. Elena had initially wanted to wait another quarter, letting the property values decline further before making our move. I convinced her to accelerate our timeline, not for revenge, though I'd be lying if I said that wasn't a factor, but because the fundamentals of the deal were sound regardless of my personal investment in the outcome. On Thursday morning, my doorbell rang. I almost didn't answer because I was in the middle of reviewing market analysis reports, but something made me check the security camera. My parents stood on my front porch, looking around with expressions of barely concealed confusion. They'd never visited my house. In the 18 months since I'd purchased it, I'd always made excuses about renovations or scheduling conflicts. They still believed I rented a cramped apartment in the older section of town, probably furnished with hand-me-downs and regret. I opened the door, and Dad's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His jaw actually dropped as he stared past me into my living room with its cathedral ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows, and view of the lake beyond. Mom tried to maintain her composure, but I could see her recalculating everything she thought she knew about my life. Are you house-sitting for someone?" she asked, stepping into my foyer with the hesitant movements of someone entering a museum. I told them no, this was my home, and invited them to look around. They moved through my space like anthropologists discovering an unknown civilization, touching furniture and asking careful questions about everything from the hardwood floors to the professional-grade kitchen appliances. Dad kept returning to the same theme. How could restaurant work possibly afford this lifestyle? Was I dealing drugs? Had I won some kind of lottery? His first assumption wasn't that I might be successful, it was that I must be doing something illegal. That's how fundamentally they'd misunderstood my capacity for achievement. I explained that I had some business investments that had worked out well. Mom immediately perked up, asking if I might be able to help them with their retirement planning since they'd been worried about their portfolio's performance lately. Amazing how quickly I'd transformed from family embarrassment to potential financial advisor. Dad wondered aloud if I could loan Christopher some money, since he was apparently a bit cash-strapped after his recent property purchase. I said I'd consider it, and they seemed satisfied with that non-commitment. After they left, I returned to my home office and made the call that would set everything in motion. I accepted Hartwell and Associates' invitation to their annual charity gala, the premier networking event for our region's development community. I normally skip these gatherings, preferring to build relationships through actual work rather than social theater. But this time I specifically requested a table with the senior partners, including Thomas Hartwell himself, who happened to be Christopher's direct supervisor. That evening, Christopher called me for the first time in nearly 3 years. He started with awkward small talk about the weather and local sports before gradually working toward his real agenda. He'd heard through family channels that I had a nice place and was curious about my investment strategies. Then he mentioned that he was working on some significant deals and wondered if I knew any serious investors who might be interested in commercial opportunities. I told him to come over Saturday morning and we could discuss it. The surprise in his voice was palpable. He'd clearly expected me to still be nursing hurt feelings from the restaurant humiliation. Saturday arrived with one of those perfect autumn mornings that makes you grateful to be alive. Christopher pulled up in his leased BMW precisely at 10, stepping out with a kind of calculated casualness that expensive cologne and designer jeans are supposed to convey. But the moment he walked into my house, his entire demeanor shifted. I watched him recalibrate, his eyes moving from room to room as he tried to process the disconnect between his assumptions and reality. He asked how I could possibly afford this on a server's salary. I explained that I had diversified income sources. For the next hour, I watched him try to solve the puzzle of my success without directly asking the questions that would reveal his ignorance. It was like watching someone attempt to assemble furniture without instructions, growing more frustrated with each failed attempt. Finally, he mentioned that Blackstone had been trying to connect with Rodriguez Development for months without success. I nodded sympathetically and said I'd heard they were quite selective about their partnerships. His eyes lit up with the kind of desperate hope that comes from months of professional rejection. Did I know anyone there? I told him I might, and that I'd be attending the charity gala next week where several Rodriguez people would be present. I've never seen anyone's expression change so dramatically. He immediately asked if I could secure him an invitation. I said I'd see what I could do, knowing full well that Christopher had specifically been excluded from the guest list after a disastrous presentation to one of our subsidiary companies the previous year. The weekend passed in a blur of final preparations. Elena and I finalized our acquisition offer for Riverside Commons, structuring the deal to include a complete community redesign that would require substantial financial contributions from existing homeowners. Those unable to meet the special assessments would have the option to sell back to us at 75 cents on the dollar. Christopher couldn't afford either option. His financial statements, which I'd obtained through perfectly legal channels during our due diligence process, showed someone living paycheck to paycheck despite his impressive salary. The monthly payments on his third property, combined with his existing debt load, had left him with virtually no liquid assets. Monday brought another call from Mom asking if I'd spoken with Christopher about helping him out with some opportunities. I said we'd had a productive conversation and that I was exploring some possibilities. She was thrilled, going on about how family should support each other and how she'd always known I'd find my way to success eventually. I asked her about that conversation when I was 17, when she'd explained that some people aren't meant for greatness. She got quiet for a moment, then said I must have misunderstood her words, that she'd always believed in my potential. She claimed the missing photographs were simply due to redecorating needs, not shame or disappointment. I let her rewrite history. It didn't matter anymore. Yesterday, I confirmed my seat at the charity gala. Table 1, alongside Thomas Hartwell, Elena Rodriguez, the mayor, and 3 other industry leaders who collectively control about 60% of our region's commercial development. Christopher would be working the room as a junior associate, probably handing out business cards and trying to make impressions that might advance his career. He had no idea that I was the reason his firm kept getting rejected for major projects. He had no idea that I owned the development where his financial future was about to implode. And he had no idea that in exactly 1 week, everyone in that ballroom would understand precisely who his failure brother really was. The morning of the gala, I took extra care getting ready. Not vanity, but recognition that perception shapes reality in professional settings. I chose a charcoal gray suit that had been tailored specifically for my build, paired with a silver tie that Elena had given me after our first major deal closed. Looking in the mirror, I saw someone who belonged in rooms where decisions were made and futures were determined. I arrived at the Grandview Hotel an hour early to review the final seating arrangements and speak with the event organizers. As expected, I was positioned at the head table with the industry's most influential figures. What I hadn't anticipated was seeing Christopher's name added to our table at the last minute. Apparently, Thomas Hartwell had decided to bring him as his guest, probably as a reward for some recent performance or his exposure to higher-level networking. For a moment, I considered requesting a table change. Then I realized this was actually perfect. Let him see firsthand exactly who his disappointing brother had become. I positioned myself at the bar with a bourbon and watched the ballroom fill with the region's development elite. Everyone was there. The pension fund managers who controlled billions in investment capital, the city planners who determined zoning futures, the architects whose visions shaped entire neighborhoods. These were people who'd been calling me directly for months, seeking my company's involvement in their projects. Christopher entered the room like he was walking onto a stage, immediately working the crowd with the kind of aggressive networking that screams desperation. I watched him move from group to group, distributing business cards and delivering what I assumed was his standard pitch about Blackstone's commitment to community-focused development. Then, he saw me. The double take was magnificent. His brain seemed to stutter as it tried to process why I would be at an event where individual tickets cost more than most people's monthly rent. He excused himself from whatever conversation he'd been having and walked over with a kind of forced casualness that fooled absolutely no one. "What are you doing here?" he asked, glancing at my name tag with its table number. "Are you someone's guest?" I smiled and explained that I'd been personally invited by the organizing committee, gesturing toward the head table where Elena was already seated and waving at me. Christopher looked genuinely panicked now, probably worried that I was going to embarrass him in front of his professional contacts. He grabbed my arm and hissed that I better not mention the restaurant incident, that these people were crucial to his career advancement. I assured him I was here for business, not family drama. When the announcement came for everyone to find their seats, Christopher's face went through what I can only describe as the 5 stages of professional grief. Denial when he realized we were at the same table. Anger when he understood I wasn't some kind of party crasher. Bargaining when he tried to figure out how to spin the situation. Depression when the implications began sinking in. And finally, a kind of desperate acceptance as we walked together toward table 1. Thomas Hartwell stood up as I approached and embraced me like we were old friends, which we'd become over the past 2 years of working together on various projects. "Michael, the man of the hour. We couldn't have pulled off the Lakefront District transformation without your vision." Christopher stood beside us with his mouth literally hanging open as Thomas introduced me to the other table guests as one of the most innovative developers in the region and the driving force behind our most successful community revitalization projects. The mayor asked how long we'd known each other. I explained that Thomas and I had been collaborating for about 3 years, ever since Rodriguez Development had started focusing on sustainable urban renewal. "Wait," said Margaret Chen, the city's planning director. "You're Michael Martinez from Rodriguez Development. I've been trying to get a meeting with you for months." Christopher looked like he was experiencing some kind of existential crisis. Here he was, sitting at a table full of people who'd been trying to do business with his loser brother for years. Thomas noticed our shared last name and asked if we were related. Before I could answer, Christopher jumped in with some ridiculous story about us being distant cousins who rarely stayed in touch. I looked directly at him and said, "Actually, we're brothers. Born and raised in the same house, went to the same schools. We had dinner together just a few weeks ago at the restaurant where I work part-time, along with our parents. Very memorable evening. The awkward silence that followed was absolutely delicious. Christopher looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Throughout dinner, it became increasingly clear to everyone at the table that Christopher had been completely unaware of who I really was. His disappointment brother was actually the reason Blackstone kept getting shut out of major development opportunities in our market. I owned significant stakes in half a dozen transformative projects across the region, and my company's reputation for community-focused development had made us the go-to partner for municipalities serious about sustainable growth. Elena asked about my restaurant work, genuinely curious why someone successful would choose to wait tables. I explained that I'd always believed success without humility was just arrogance in expensive clothing, That staying connected to service work kept me grounded and reminded me who we're really building communities for. Christopher kept trying to steer conversations away from me, but every attempt backfired. The more he tried to minimize my presence, the more interested everyone became in my work and perspective. By dessert, he was sweating through his shirt despite the hotel's perfect climate control. During the networking portion of the evening, Christopher cornered me near the bar with the kind of barely controlled fury that comes from having your worldview completely shattered in public. "Why didn't you ever tell me what you really do?" he demanded. I reminded him that he'd never actually asked, that he'd spent years making assumptions about my failure without ever showing enough interest to discover what I was actually building. He tried to pivot, suddenly becoming the loving brother who'd always believed in me, talking about how we should join forces and leverage our combined expertise. How this had all been a big misunderstanding, how family should stick together in business. I asked him if he remembered what he'd said at the restaurant about telling people I was in prison because it was less embarrassing than the truth. Asked if he remembered his date questioning whether I had developmental disabilities, while he laughed. He tried to dismiss it as harmless sibling rivalry, said I was being oversensitive, that all families give each other grief sometimes. I told him that families don't humiliate each other in public spaces. Don't spend decades systematically destroying each other's self-worth. Don't erase each other from family narratives to avoid embarrassment. That's when Thomas approached with Elena, both of them looking like they had something important to discuss. Thomas asked if I'd made a decision about the Riverside Commons property acquisition. I looked directly at Christopher and said, "Yes, we're moving forward with a complete redevelopment plan. We'll be sending special assessment notices to current homeowners tomorrow morning." Christopher's face went from red to white in about 3 seconds. He asked what that meant exactly. Elena began explaining our vision: complete infrastructure overhaul, architectural redesign, sustainable energy systems, enhanced community spaces. The improvements would require substantial financial contributions from existing homeowners, approximately $95,000 per unit. Those unable to meet the assessment could sell their properties back to us at current market value minus development costs. Christopher pulled me aside with shaking hands and asked if this was some kind of joke. I assured him it was simply business. Sometimes investments don't perform as expected, and investors have to make difficult decisions. He said he couldn't afford a $95,000 assessment. He was already stretched thin with his current mortgage payments and credit obligations. I shrugged and mentioned that the buyback option might be his best alternative, though he'd probably take a significant loss given current market conditions and his purchase timing. The realization dawned on his face like sunrise over a disaster zone. This wasn't coincidence. I knew exactly what I was doing. His failure brother had been orchestrating this entire situation while he'd been completely oblivious. He called me vindictive and cruel, said family members don't destroy each other financially. I laughed and asked which one of us had started this pattern of mutual destruction. Reminded him that I'd been perfectly content to let him believe whatever he wanted about my life until he decided to humiliate me in front of my coworkers and customers. He stormed off, nearly colliding with a waiter carrying a tray of champagne glasses. I spent the rest of the evening making connections and discussing future projects. Thomas mentioned our golf game the following weekend. Margaret Chen asked if Rodriguez Development would consider partnering with the city on an affordable housing initiative. 3 different investment firms inquired about opportunities to collaborate on our next major acquisition. The next morning brought a series of increasingly frantic calls from my family. First Mom, crying about how Christopher had told them everything, how I was sabotaging his career and his financial future, how she didn't understand why I would do such terrible things to my own brother. I reminded her about the restaurant, about her explanation to strangers that they pretended to have only one son, about the missing photographs and the casual cruelty that had defined our relationship for decades. She got quiet, then tried to explain that they'd only been embarrassed because they didn't understand my choices, that they'd thought I was wasting my potential, that their disappointment came from a place of love and concern. I asked if love typically manifested as public humiliation and systematic emotional abuse. She didn't have an answer. Dad called an hour later with his characteristic directness. We needed a family meeting to resolve this situation. Christopher was facing serious financial difficulties because of my vindictive business decisions. They might need to help him avoid foreclosure, but their own retirement savings weren't in great shape. He asked if I would consider modifying our development plans to exclude Christopher's property from the special assessment. Maybe we could work out some kind of family accommodation. I told him I'd think about it, which seemed to provide some relief. What I was actually thinking about was how their retirement portfolio was heavily invested in the downtown commercial properties that Rodriguez Development was about to acquire and completely restructure. This morning, the special assessment notices were delivered to all Riverside Commons homeowners. Christopher's assessment, $95,000, due within 90 days. Simultaneously, we announced our acquisition of the Meridian Business District, the commercial complex where my parents' retirement fund had concentrated most of their investments. My phone has been buzzing nonstop with notifications, text messages, missed calls, voicemails, all from family members in various states of panic and rage. Mom saying she's having anxiety attacks. Dad demanding we talk immediately. Christopher alternating between calling me every profane name imaginable and begging me to reconsider the assessment. I haven't responded to any of them yet. Part of me wants to let them marinate in this uncertainty for a while longer, to experience a fraction of the helplessness and humiliation they've made me feel for most of my adult life. But another part of me is sitting here wondering if financial devastation is a proportionate response to emotional abuse. If becoming the architect of their worst fears makes me the villain in this story, regardless of how it started. Then I remember Christopher's smirk when he called me a waste of oxygen. Mom's casual explanation of why I'd been erased from family photos. Dad throwing money on my table like I was panhandling for spare change. I think they're about to learn that actions have consequences, and that the family disappointment they created might not be as powerless as they assumed. 10 days have passed since my last update, and the aftermath has been more intense than I could have anticipated. After ignoring 3 days of increasingly desperate communications from my family, I finally agreed to meet them. Not because I felt guilty or was ready to forgive, but because I wanted to see their faces when they fully grasped how completely they'd misjudged me. I suggested meeting at Cornerstone Cafe, a neutral location downtown where I could control the environment and narrative. I arrived 20 minutes early and chose a corner table with clear sightlines to the entrance, positioning myself where I could observe their reactions without feeling trapped. My parents arrived first, and I was struck by how much they'd aged in just 2 weeks. Mom's usually perfect composure had cracked, her eyes were puffy from crying, her hands shook slightly as she ordered coffee, and she kept glancing at me like I might disappear if she looked away too long. Dad had developed a defeated slump to his shoulders that I'd never seen before, the kind of posture that comes from realizing you fundamentally misunderstood something important. Christopher walked in 5 minutes later, and his energy was completely different from theirs. Where they looked broken and pleading, he radiated barely contained fury. The moment he sat down, he launched into me with the kind of righteous indignation that only comes from someone who's never had to face real consequences for their actions. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he demanded, loud enough to turn heads at nearby tables. "Are you happy now that you've destroyed my financial future? Is this some kind of psychotic revenge fantasy?" I looked at him calmly and asked if he was seriously positioning himself as the victim in this situation. Reminded him that he'd started this entire chain of events by humiliating me in front of my coworkers and customers, by spending years treating me like a personal failure that reflected poorly on the family name. He tried to dismiss it as harmless sibling teasing, said I was being vindictive and petty over some innocent family jokes, that I was taking everything too seriously, that he'd never meant to hurt my feelings. Dad jumped in, saying that while Christopher might have been insensitive, my response was disproportionate and cruel. That family members don't try to destroy each other financially over hurt feelings. I pulled out my phone and played an audio recording I'd made when I was 19. Dad explaining to me that I should accept my limitations, that Christopher was the one with real potential, that I should focus on supporting his success rather than competing with him, that I'd always be mediocre at best and should make peace with being ordinary. The color drained from Dad's face as he heard his own voice delivering that crushing verdict. He asked where I'd gotten that recording. I explained that I'd started documenting their put-downs and criticisms when I was 18, After years of gaslighting where they'd deny saying things that had devastated me, that I had dozens of recordings spanning over a decade, capturing them systematically destroying my confidence and self-worth. Mom started crying harder, saying they'd only been trying to manage my expectations, that they didn't want me to experience the disappointment of failing at things beyond my capabilities, that their criticism came from love, from wanting to protect me from unrealistic dreams. I laughed, actually laughed, at the absurdity of calling systematic emotional abuse protection. Asked what kind of love makes you tell your child they're destined for mediocrity. What kind of protection involves erasing them from family photos and pretending they don't exist when friends visit? Christopher tried to redirect the conversation back to his immediate crisis. The special assessment he couldn't afford. The fact that his bosses now knew he'd lied about being an only child. His concern that his position at Blackstone was in jeopardy because of the professional embarrassment I'd caused him. I told him I couldn't care less about his problems. That maybe he should ask our parents for help, since according to their narrative, he was their only son anyway. Dad cleared his throat and admitted they couldn't help Christopher because they were facing their own financial crisis. The Meridian Business District acquisition had devastated their retirement portfolio, and they were looking at losses that would force them to work several additional years before they could afford to retire. He looked at me with desperate pleading in his eyes and asked if there was anything I could do to help them recover from this financial disaster. I asked why I would help people who'd spent my entire adult life treating me like an embarrassment and a failure. Mom started talking about blood being thicker than water, about family loyalty and sticking together during difficult times, about how they'd raised me and sacrificed for me and deserved better than this vindictive treatment. I pulled out my wallet and counted out $85, laying the bills on the table between us. Told Dad that maybe it was time for him to finally make something of himself, that perhaps Christopher could find him something entry-level at his firm. The look on Dad's face when his own words came back to haunt him was worth every moment of planning this had required. He stood up so abruptly that his chair fell backward, started yelling that I had no right to speak to him that way, that I was being cruel and vindictive and immature. Other cafe patrons were staring now. The barista looked like she was considering calling security. I remained completely calm and told him to lower his voice or leave, that I wasn't the one making a public scene. He sat back down, red-faced and trembling with impotent rage. Mom tried a different approach, saying she was genuinely sorry if their parenting had made me feel undervalued, that they'd always wanted what was best for me, that they were proud of my success and wanted to rebuild our relationship. I asked why she was proud now, when she'd spent years being embarrassed by my existence. Was it just because I had money? Because I could potentially help them with their financial problems? Where was this pride when I was working construction? When I got my license? When I bought my first investment property? Christopher interrupted, saying we needed to stop dwelling on ancient history and focus on solutions. That he was willing to apologize for anything he'd said that hurt me, but he needed help with the assessment or he'd lose his house. I told him there were 3 options available: pay the $95,000 assessment, sell the property back to Rodriguez Development at a substantial loss, or let the house go into foreclosure and destroy his credit for the next 7 years. He asked if I could make a special exception for family. I looked him directly in the eyes and said, "Business is business. No exceptions." Dad slammed his hand on the table hard enough to rattle our coffee cups, asking what kind of son deliberately destroys his own family's financial security over petty grievances. I told him I'd learned from the best, from parents who taught me it was acceptable to treat people like garbage if they didn't meet your expectations, who demonstrated that love was conditional on success, who showed me that family members could be discarded when they became inconvenient or embarrassing. Mom was sobbing openly now, saying this wasn't the boy they'd raised, that she didn't recognize the cold, vengeful person I'd become. I told her she was absolutely right. I wasn't the boy they'd raised anymore. I was the man who'd survived their constant criticism and emotional abandonment, who'd succeeded despite their sabotage, not because of their support, who'd learned to value himself when his own family wouldn't. Christopher tried one final angle, lowering his voice to what he probably thought was a threatening whisper. He said he knew some things about my business partner Elena that could cause serious problems if they became public, that maybe we could help each other avoid unnecessary complications. I called Elena right there on speakerphone, told her that Christopher was threatening to spread damaging rumors about her if I didn't intervene in his financial crisis. Elena's response was immediate and crystal clear. Christopher, that would constitute defamation and possibly extortion. I have attorneys specifically for situations like this. I suggest you think very carefully about your next words. Christopher went pale and started backpedaling frantically, saying he was just desperate and didn't mean it as a threat, that he was looking for any possible solution to his problems. Elena said she understood desperation, but suggested he should consider speaking with a financial advisor about his options rather than making implied threats against people who were simply conducting legitimate business. Then she hung up. The silence at our table was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that cafe. Finally, Dad asked in a voice barely above a whisper what I wanted from them. If this was purely about revenge, or if there was something they could do to repair the damage they'd caused to our relationship. I told them I didn't want anything from them anymore, that I'd spent over a decade trying to earn their approval and respect, and I'd finally realized I didn't need it. That the assessment on Christopher's property was happening regardless of our family dynamics, and their retirement losses were simply market realities that had nothing to do with personal vendettas. But I also said I wasn't going out of my way to destroy them. These were sound business decisions that made financial sense regardless of our family history. Christopher's house being in that development was genuinely coincidental. I'd been analyzing that acquisition for months before the restaurant incident ever happened. Mom asked if this meant I was cutting them off completely, if I was walking away from the family forever. I said I hadn't decided yet, that I'd spent 32 years being their son and had received nothing but criticism, disappointment, and humiliation in return. That maybe it was time to discover what life looked like without their constant judgment and emotional manipulation. Christopher started getting angry again, saying I was being overdramatic and acting like they'd committed some kind of abuse. That every family has problems and conflicts, and I was blowing normal sibling rivalry out of proportion. I stood up and told him I was done with this conversation, that he could figure out his housing situation on his own, that my parents could contact me again when they were ready to offer a genuine apology, not one motivated by financial desperation, and that I had more important things to do than listen to them minimize decades of psychological damage. Dad asked one last time if I was really going to abandon my family over hurt feelings and ancient grudges. I told him I wasn't abandoning anyone. I was finally standing up for myself and establishing boundaries that should have existed years ago. Then I left them sitting there with their coffee and their regrets. Over the following 2 weeks, the consequences of their choices continued to unfold with mathematical precision. Christopher couldn't secure additional financing for the assessment and couldn't afford to keep the property. He ended up selling his house back to Rodriguez Development, taking a loss of approximately $47,000 in the process. His situation at Blackstone deteriorated rapidly after his supervisors learned about his attempted blackmail of Elena. He was placed on immediate suspension pending a formal review, and his professional reputation in our relatively small industry was effectively destroyed. Rebecca, his girlfriend from the restaurant, ended their relationship after hearing the complete story from mutual friends who'd attended the charity gala. My parents had to completely restructure their retirement timeline, pushing their planned departure from the workforce back by at least 6 years due to the losses in their portfolio. Dad took a part-time consulting position to supplement their income, while Mom started working as a substitute teacher, something she'd sworn she'd never do again after retiring from education 15 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were both now working service jobs, the kind of honest work they'd always looked down on when I was doing it. Mom continued sending me long, emotional text messages about how much she missed me and how sorry she was for any pain they'd caused. But the apologies always included justifications, explanations about their intentions, their concerns, their belief that they'd been protecting me from disappointment. A real apology doesn't come with footnotes explaining why the abuse was actually justified. Dad never reached out again directly. I heard through extended family that he was bitter about what he called my vindictive overreaction, that he felt I'd betrayed the family that had raised and supported me. Yesterday, I ran into my Aunt Patricia at the farmer's market downtown. She asked what was happening with our family, said Mom had been calling her in tears but wouldn't explain the specific details. I gave her the condensed version of events. She looked troubled, but not entirely surprised. Your parents always had a blind spot when it came to favoritism, she said. After Christopher's early struggles with learning disabilities, they got so focused on supporting him that they forgot you needed parenting too. When he finally started succeeding, they almost resented how easy things seemed to come to you. She told me something I'd never known. Christopher had required extensive tutoring and special educational support throughout elementary and middle school. My parents had spent thousands of dollars on specialists, therapists, and private instruction to help him overcome significant learning challenges. By the time he reached high school and started flourishing academically, they'd developed a pattern of viewing struggle as worthy of attention and support, while treating success as something that didn't require acknowledgement or encouragement. It didn't excuse decades of emotional abuse, but it helped me understand how intelligent people can convince themselves they're doing the right thing while systematically damaging their child's self-worth. But understanding the psychology behind their behavior doesn't obligate me to accept it or continue subjecting myself to it. 3 weeks ago, I sold my remaining shares in the Riverside Commons development, not because of family pressure, but because it represented excellent timing for profit-taking. Romano's Bistro asked if I'd consider becoming a silent partner in their expansion plans, and I'm seriously considering the investment. The restaurant industry fascinates me, and I've learned valuable lessons about community building from my time waiting tables. As for my family, I've decided to let that relationship remain dormant for the foreseeable future. Maybe in a year or two, when the immediate financial crisis has passed and emotions have cooled, we can attempt to rebuild something healthier. Or maybe we can't. Either way, I'm done trying to earn the approval of people who decided I wasn't worth their respect before I even had a chance to prove myself. If there's one profound truth I've learned from this entire experience, it's that sometimes the family you're born into isn't the family you deserve. Sometimes standing up for yourself means being willing to walk away from people who claim to love you but consistently treat you like you're disposable. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the permission to stop apologizing for your success to people who spent years predicting your failure. I'm 32 years old, financially independent, personally fulfilled, and finally free from the weight of their expectations and disappointments. I have friends who celebrate my achievements, colleagues who respect my judgment, and a sense of self-worth that doesn't depend on external validation. For the first time in my adult life, I'm not trying to prove anything to anyone. I'm just living, building communities, creating value, treating people with dignity, and discovering what happiness looks like when you're not constantly seeking approval from people who've already decided you're not worth their investment. That, more than any business success or financial victory, feels like the true triumph in this story. Not the revenge, but the liberation. Not the devastation of my family's finances, but the construction of my own authentic life. Some chapters end with reconciliation. Others end with the recognition that some relationships are too toxic to survive, no matter how much history they carry. This one ends with me choosing myself for the first time in 32 years.